Welcome to our Worship Facility webinar, Remodel, Repurpose, or Rebuild, Evaluating the Options and Determining the Best Path Forward, sponsored by BGW, Building God's Way. I'm Gene Lass, editor of Worship Facility. Joining us today are church strategy consultant Matt Roberts, architect David Tyson, and senior preliminary designer Austin Fredrickson. Matt, why don't you get us started?
Great, thank you. Man, it's so good to be here with you today. And as a pastor for the last 25 years, I have the privilege of leading a network of churches called the Genesis Project. And across the country, we've had multiple opportunities to buy, to build, to remodel buildings. And one of the things early on for me that became so apparent is is how underprepared I was in this space to really know how to proceed, to know what the best and most effective path forward was for us as a church. You know, it's one thing to lead a church and to know all that we've learned through Bible college and seminary, and facilities is such a big deal inside a church. It's a dominant budget item. It has a lot to do with church health and vitality. And to recognize how under-equipped we were as a ministry team to really be able to navigate that space and to understand the best path forward for us has led us into just some great relationships with guys like Dave and Austin and Building God's Way that have really helped us to navigate and make good strategic decisions for the health of our ministry moving forward. So we're excited today just to really talk about that, and hopefully for you guys who are pastors and ministry leaders that are tuning in and listening today, we'd love to just answer some questions as you wrestle with growth, as you wrestle with the trajectory of your ministry and what that looks like in the physical space that you are worshiping and meeting in. And so we're going to look at multiple options that hopefully you can all look at in your own community and really be able to weigh the pros and cons of how do we move forward as a church? Is it new construction on a piece of land that we found? Is it to repurpose an old space or an old building in our community that's maybe not being used right now? Or is it to stay put where we're at and really take an old, and sometimes church buildings get tired, and remodel that and revitalize that space and that building? So that's really what we want to discuss over the next few minutes today, is just how you can lean into a team of experts, but also really take a look yourself at the specific community and situation that you're in and be able to navigate a best path forward for you. So Dave, I'd love to kick it over to you as we begin to talk about those options and really expound upon what pastors can look for in their community as far as the next step facility-wise.
Yeah, and I think one of the things as we think about this is just kind of overarching before we kind of dive into each of these topics. You know, a lot of times the question is well, which direction is best? And, you know, first and foremost, getting Christian counsel and good, wise counsel in doing this is really important. Having architects and people on board with you, having contractors that can help you through some of these things. Church leadership consultants are great as well. But really the starting point for this comes down to determining your priorities first and foremost. You've got to understand what is the most important thing to us. You know, is it important that we do this quick? Is it important that we do this, you know, in a different realm of different spaces and different understanding of different things? And so I think each one of these kind of pieces kind of has some real solid benefits. And it's not just a thing where we say, this is the one that if you can do this, it's the way you have to do it. It's more determining your priorities and then how does it fit within kind of this broader realm of these three main pieces. And we do that typically at BGW with a charrette process where we kind of bring the team of your group to the table. It's a little bit longer of a process that we deal with. It's a 3-day process, but it's kind of is a little longer explanation is what I mean. But essentially what we're trying to do is bring the right people to the table to help you determine those priorities. So whether that's a contractor, an architect, and more importantly, it's the people on your team that understand your vision, right? It's the church leaders that you have that help you through that process of determining what those priorities are. Austin, I don't know if you have anything else on that kind of overarching principles.
Yeah, I think that's good, Dave.
Yeah. Austin, what would you say for pastors who are listening today makes a good team to bring onto a building committee, to bring into a charrette process as they're dreaming about what their facility could be moving forward? What would you say about the mix of that team that's important?
Yeah, great question, Matt. First and foremost is unity. You need a team that can work together and has a common purpose of moving forward and seeing God glorified through the process. Sometimes people say, oh, I know this guy who's in construction, or this guy has a lot of experience, but really it's the heart more than the experience that matters in my experience. And getting the right people who are along for the ride and who aren't going to be causing trouble. And so the experience comes after the heart for creating God's kingdom and seeing your ministry furthered. And once you have that, then it's really diversity of people. Maybe there are people with construction or design experience, maybe, interior designers, or have a builder, in your church, but then also diversity of ministry input. You want the worship leader there, you want children's ministry leader there, you want some deacons or elders there to get a good, well-rounded approach. It can't just be all, old guys. You need men, women, old, young, diversity of backgrounds and experiences, I think, will really help round out that team.
Well, let's kind of jump into this, each of these topics. I want to make sure we have enough time to kind of talk through some of these. So, the first one, as we think about the three pieces, Matt, you mentioned them again. It's the new construction, it's the rebuild, it's remodel, and then it's repurposing existing spaces. So we'll kind of jump into that first one, that new construction rebuild. And so just kind of some pros and cons for that. I think one of the biggest benefits, and Matt, you talk about this often, I think too, is just the fact that you have, you can do whatever you want within that space. You get to reset what your vision is and who you are.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for a church that's really looking to establish identity through their facility, new construction is just a way that you have no limitations. Obviously, I shouldn't say no limitations. Budget's always the big limitation.
Sure.
For all of us as ministry leaders, which I think budget is probably one of the things that typically with new construction, that's I think more than likely going to be the most expensive option. But if it's something that you count the cost and feel like you can afford as a ministry, you just have so much more flexibility moving forward. You're not dealing with, again, when we talk about the things we don't learn as pastors in seminary, like load-bearing walls. As pastors, we can knock on walls and listen, but we really don't know what we're talking about, right? So all of the things you wrestle with, and can we get a big enough space? Can we get sight lines in an existing building? Is the ceiling going to be high enough for a great worship experience? And we're able to pull a lot of those unknowns off the table in new construction, which really helps in being able to cast a vision that's not hindered by existing structure.
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point there about flexibility over time too. There's a lot of the old churches with the load-bearing exterior walls and interior walls. It's not that easy to widen a hallway if you can't get the kids up and down, into their classrooms. Some of those things are really difficult. And then thinking about what does your ministry look like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? If you build new, you can kind of set things up for flexibility over time, so that the future generations have more opportunities to expand. Maybe there's not a property line right behind the building, or, you can set it up in ways that it's much easier and much more cost effective moving forward. So that flexibility over time, I think, is a huge benefit of saying, if we remodel now, it will be good for the next 5 years, but we have no idea what we're going to do after that, right? Totally. If you build new, you can kind of create a long-term plan and have flexibility down the road, as none of us know what ministry might look like in 10, 20, 50 years, but we can at least plan to be flexible when that comes.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Dave, wouldn't you say that probably the cost of ownership as well, as far as how an old building functions in comparison to a new building, is a part of this equation as well, where it might not be upfront cost savings, but maybe cost savings over the life of a building, 20 years. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think what you're really thinking about here is you're thinking about an investment, right? And so, yeah, we mentioned that more than likely there are sometimes some higher upfront costs. The other thing too is to think about is that you aren't going to have the same amount of time, you know, in a remodel scenario or in where you buy an existing building, you can probably move in a little quicker, but you're investing in your vision and your future as you're building that new building. And so with that, at the same time, you're also investing in a lot of those systems, right? And so you're getting new systems, you're getting new things, and you're able to kind of move that forward. I've just recently, my wife and I, we consider ourselves serial remodelers. We kind of remodel and sell and remodel and sell. And just recently we built for the first time. So this was kind of a new thing. We did a new build now. And so the difference in that is that when I buy an existing house, I walk into it, and probably within the first year, I'm probably replacing the water heater. Chances are I may have an issue with my furnace. And, you know, I've also got to move some walls and stuff, but I can pretty quickly move in and I'm in, right? I just got to figure it out. The other side of things is with a new build, I'm out of a house for, you know, the amount of time that it takes to build. But once I'm in there, I've got everything how I want it. And chances are, at least I'm hoping now, this is new to me, but I'm hoping that, you know, at some point I won't have to be replacing the furnace or the water heater in the first year, right? And so there's some different things, there's some different traits to that, but you're investing kind of in your future, and you're not having to, you're hopefully building, you know, the systems they build now are better than they were 20 years ago. And so you're able to kind of upgrade that in that way and keep that process moving forward.
Yeah.
But I will say,
I think too,
go ahead, Austin.
yeah, I think too that transition time is really key for a lot of churches too. I was recently working with a church in Ohio. They have about 1,000-seat sanctuary, and we got to remodel it. And we said, well, it's going to take about 3 months. You're going to be out of your sanctuary. And that's huge to have 1,000 people. What do you do with them? You know, and so if you're building new, you don't run into those problems. And we've talked with the builder and the client for hours on end about how are we managing this transition? How long is it going to take? How soon can they be back into the sanctuary? And some of those issues you don't have when you build new.
Dave, what would you say if a church is looking at building a new facility in their community when it comes to site selection? What are we looking for when it comes to land, utilities? You know, one of the things I've learned working with you guys is you don't ever want to buy a hill, right? Like there's a lot of costs that comes along with that. So what are some of the things that you would recommend to a church as they're beginning to look at site selection for a new build, and how can BGW be a help in that process and a service in site selection?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of studies and things that you can start to do. Obviously, you want it to be the right size, right? So that's the first and foremost thing, is make sure it fits your congregation. There's a lot of good rules of thumbs out there. BGW does have kind of a little document that we put together, a little bit of kind of we kind of plug in some different numbers based on a discussion with you, and kind of on the other end, it spits out kind of, here's how many acreage you should be looking for. Essentially, that dials down to somewhere around 1 acre for every 100 to 125 people that are in your congregation. So if you've got 600 people, you want to be thinking about a 5.5 to 6 acre piece of property. That's kind of your starting point. At that point, that number will fluctuate differently depending on the different site features you've had. And there's any number of stories we could get into about the things that you find on the site. Again, I'm going to stress it multiple times today, but you've got to have wise counsel on your team, whether that's architects, whether that's civil engineers. Here we're talking about civil engineers, right? Or soils reports, or different things that you start to get into, and having people on your team that know that stuff ahead of time, that know your local requirements and what's going to happen. You know, when we go to different areas of the country, we know there's certain issues that happen that you don't see other places. In some of their areas of the country, there's earthquakes, right? In other areas of the country, there's swampy areas that almost happen on almost every piece of property. And so there's just different things in different areas that you're going to be kind of looking for. And all that does is it eats away at your total square footage that you have when it comes to that. So analyzing the property is crucial to what you're doing. And you'll a lot of times you'll see that reflected in the cost too, right? So as you go to see something, you might say, this looks awesome. What a great deal we got here. It's half the price of any of the other properties around that. Most of the time, there's a reason that it's half the price of any other properties around it.
Great. Yeah. Great advice. I think another thing that our team would love to help you out with as you're looking at property is demographics. What's the traffic numbers in front of your building? You know, a lot of times what churches don't realize is still the most effective means of marketing a church is the sign in front of your building. How many people are driving past that every day? How easy is traffic flow? I know Austin, we've worked with projects before where getting people in and out of a parking lot becomes a nightmare, which is not one of the things we think about, right? Like, how are we altering traffic patterns and getting people in? But I think all of us would agree that doing your due diligence on site selection can save you a lot of money and also leave you much happier with the end product if you do that well. So as Dave said, make sure you're leaning into experts in that process. One of the things that I love as a pastor about BGW is so many of those services are offered complimentary and free up front. We just want to serve ministries and help you make the right decision. And so make sure you reach out and get somebody with eyes on your site selection process. So David, I think it'd be great if we can maybe just show a few examples of some of the new construction projects we built, shows kind of some of the scope. One of the things that I can tell you guys on behalf of these architects is that BGW does not believe in building boxes that all look the same, but really building buildings that fit in the neighborhood that they're put in, that work really well. And hopefully at the end of the day, tell the story of a ministry that when you walk in, you'll be able to recognize inside of the building, really the ethos, the mission, the identity of who that church is. So allowing the building to be a tool that begins to tell the story and the mission of the church. And we've got some great examples to show you.
Yeah, and I think, again, this kind of gets into one of the really good pros for building a new building is you get to determine the layout. And this is something that really you start to get in a little bit of a church historical discussion as we think about the actual layout of buildings, but how we lay out churches is different than we used to lay out churches. The simple fact is if you go down any road that local church you find along the way that's an old red brick building, right? You walk into that church and you go into a narthex and their narthex is considered kind of their coat closet. It's a 10 by 10 space before you go into the auditorium. You go into the auditorium and there's pews. To get to kids spaces, you go through the auditorium, you go down two sets of stairs, 2 lefts and a right, and you're in the kids space. Maybe you got to go back a different route to get back to the sanctuary. It's very linear in how we do things church-wise 50 years ago versus how we do churches now, which are more set up around a community center. We're trying to build community. And a lot of that is because while we're a local church, the people that are coming to our church are coming from further and further away. And so at this point, then what we see is people are trying to reconnect and re-engage in a church. The church becomes their Christian community, their safe haven that they're trying to kind of build those relationships with. And so creating community type spaces is crucially important. And one of the ways that we do that really, and I'm going to bring up kind of a slide set here, is by creating what we call a third place, a gathering center is really what that is. It's a hub and spoke concept from a large plan. And so when we build those new churches, we're thinking about how can we create this space where we draw folks from the parking lot into that space. And then from there, they go to the different places. If they need to go somewhere else, they come back to that community space and it becomes that central hub. So what I'll tell churches a lot of times is when we come in to that space, we come into this space and then we draw folks in there. And then when they get in there, they ought to be able to see, here's where I go to the sanctuary. Here's where the kitchen is. Here's where I get a cup of coffee. Here's where the kids are. Here's where the office, all these spaces ought to radiate off of that central space. So it's a little different than that traditional scenario where you kind of get in and it becomes a maze where you can get lost and it kind of is hard to find things. And a lot of churches that are in those type of buildings have to create a large greeting team where they've got people at every corner. They're trying to direct folks in different places when they're new and things like that. And so some of the spaces that are centered around that, the first one we have is, it kind of is a little bit different of a concept. It's a newer one. It's called, kind of has a front gathering area. You'll see an entry kind of patio with a gathering area. Still, that entry gathering space that you see at the bottom of the screen radiates to all the different spaces. You've got a cafe, an auditorium, some multi-use kids space, but it all kind of is off that central space. And the goal of this is actually to use some of that exterior space. One thing you'll notice too is that a lot of these gathering areas become the central hub. They are the church, and that's where a lot of things happen. So because of that, the size of those spaces has gotten larger and larger over the last 15 to 20 years as we really desire as a church in America and crave that interaction, that community space. The other one that we kind of have used kind of creates that same gathering space, that central area through the center. And so it has a kind of a central column that drops off different spaces along there. Again, still creating that central. This one shows kind of a pretty strong central area that we start to go kind of through that in. And so it kind of helps us understand and organizes. As you look at this plan, it makes sense. This is where the gathering happens. And when you can organize that in a plan, then a lot of times it works out a lot better in reality as well, as we think about centralizing in the gathering space according to that.
Dave, wouldn't you say that in these two designs, the predominant outdoor space and indoor space, a lot of that has to do with climate, where these churches are located? You can get a lot more outdoor space in California than you can in the Northeast, right?
Yeah, and these are by no means the end all be all to any plans. We wanted to bring kind of a couple that show really the central gathering area as the key to this, right? And so a lot of times when churches are doing new designs, they're doing designs that have this gathering space, that have things radiating off of that. All of these are, custom fit obviously to that specific church with the needs that they had. They're all going to vary differently within that.
Austin, can you speak a little bit when it comes to new construction, and maybe dig in how that charrette process unfolds and how we come to a floor plan like we're looking at right now?
Yeah, so as Dave mentioned earlier, it's a 3-day on-site intensive. We've got the whole team there, whoever you want to bring. Sometimes that's 3 people, sometimes it's 20 people. And we come in and we really start with a blank slate. We've obviously done a lot of church designs, but every community is different, every ministry is different, every context and site is different. So we don't come in with a pre-designed plan. We come in ready to listen and to learn from your team. And then by the second day, believe it or not, we'll have something about to this level where we can present to your team and say, here's how big the building is in rough square footage, and here's how the spaces are related, how you move through the building, security, for the children and otherwise. And we let people comment, and we'll move walls and, change orientations and say, what if we flipped it, 180 degrees and put it over here, looking from the site plan and the floor plan like you just saw. And so it's a very collaborative, really fun couple of days. Then by the third day of that charrette, we'll have an updated plan that's, a little bit closer to what the final preliminary design would look like, as well as exterior views of the building where you can fly around the outside of the building. And so it comes together really quickly, especially on a new building. David could tell you that new builds are always a little bit more fun because you're starting from a blank slate, and it comes together pretty quick.
Yeah, I can say from my perspective, we've gone through the charrette process and also done it other ways. And it's amazing the work you can get done in 3 days. And it's mostly because you have the decision makers that have set aside that time to come together. So if you think about a more traditional build where an architect is passing documents back and forth, and then you've got to get that out to your teams and get everybody to look at it and gather input and bring it back. I can tell you from a pastoral perspective, the charrette is able to fit inside of 3 days what would likely take 3 to 6 months to get done just from a communication perspective. So there's something powerful about bringing that team together and getting everybody hyper focused on building. It keeps everybody on the same wavelength and gives you an opportunity to bring a professional in to really guide that conversation.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, the church's commitment is about 2 to 3 hours each day. And then we're back working in our hotel room or at Starbucks or what have you. So it's about 2 or 3 hours each day, 3 days in a row typically. And it's a good way to get that initial step taken care of really quickly.
Yeah. Which is, I think, important to say too, that it's a charrette is not just a tool for new construction. So any 3 of these options would begin with a charrette: remodel, a repurpose, or new construction, all begin with that charrette process. So that's kind of the first tool that gives you a lot of deliverables coming out of that process. So most of the slides that you see here today are actually a part of what our deliverable package is for a charrette, as far as the floor plan, site plan, and some 3D renderings of how a new building or a remodel building is going to look at the end of the project. So a lot of value there.
Yeah, and I would even say for, you know, as we're going to get into kind of the remodel coming up here next, is that one, it's almost most beneficial for the remodel. So many times we're living in a building and we can't see the differences of things. And so bringing in some folks from the outside to kind of look at things and guide us through those conversations. It's amazing how there's a lot of times I'll go into a church and it seems pretty clear to me, but because the church is used to using the building a certain way for a certain amount, you know, for however long they've been doing that, it's hard for them to see, hey, this is an obvious switch that we make here and those kind of things. And so that charrette is extremely valuable for, you know, just space planning and understanding your building better and you making better utilization of that.
I always use the example when you move into a house, the first 2 weeks you live in a new house, you recognize everything that's broken, the drawers that stick, the, you know, paint that needs to be touched up. And after a month, you become so used to the workarounds of what's broken, you stop recognizing those things. And the same thing is true in church, right? And if you think about, we use so much time and energy inside of a church. I think, Dave, you brought up the example of having ushers at every door in a building that's not laid out well. And when you begin to think, gosh, if we fix that, we could redirect so much of that energy into more productive things. It gets really exciting. It really is a rejuvenating process for a church to have the permission to start calling broken things broken and then start dreaming up a common solution together. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that probably provides us a good segue to kind of jump into the remodel portion of things. And, you know, I think when we think about the remodel, what we're really discussing here is you're in an existing building and this is, you know, maybe you don't have the opportunity for various reasons to buy new property. Maybe you don't have the finances to do that or whatever. I always think about, people always say like, how much of a percentage of your work is new build and how much is remodel? And this goes back a little bit, but in 2007, 2008, that was when we saw the biggest switch between new build and remodel. Before that, everybody was saying, you know, this building is terrible that we're living in. We got to have a new church building. We're going to buy this new piece of property. We're building new and everything and all that. And then the economic downturn happened in 2007. And suddenly those same people were coming back and saying, you know, that building that we've got, it's got good bones, looks really good. We're really, I think we're going in a good direction on this. I think, you know, things are going to happen. We just got to figure a few things out. And that's really what this is about, is a lot of times you can use what you have in such an impactful way. And the benefit that you have, I think one key benefit is that you can do that incrementally. You know, when you build a new building, you're committing to saying, we've got to make this move. And in order to make this move, we've got to reproduce kids space and offices and auditorium and all these things to get that way. A lot of times with a remodel, you have all that stuff. Maybe there is, like Austin was mentioning, there's a couple of things that you've got to live without for a few months as construction happens, but you can make those incremental growth points. And so you create a master plan and you set that up to say, here's the direction we're going as a church in this existing building. And then when the money and funds come along, you're able to say, all right, we're going to redo the youth building. You know, we're going to repaint this hall because we know in the future we're going to use that anyways. And so some of these small wins or small gains can really happen quickly as you begin to understand those things, because you don't have to do them all at the same time. And so I think that's kind of one of the key pieces as we think about the remodel, one of the benefits to that. Austin, do you have another couple other ideas on pros for that or benefits to that?
I mean, this is going to be a big deal to some churches and not a deal at all to others, but historical context. You know, a lot of churches are deeply rooted and planted in a community. And there's a lot of people in the church who say, you know, I remember my dad built this when I was 10 years old, and, you know, the neighbors, you know, there's a lot of contextual things that's really great about staying rooted and staying planted in one location. for some churches, it's not as big of a deal, and the historical context and the story of the church doesn't matter as much. But for some churches, that really is a big deal. And, you know, if you moved 5 miles down the road to a farm field or something like that, it's going to have a big impact on the community that you're in. And so, you know, remodeling is sometimes the right thing to do, even if you can afford to move.
And I think to that point, Austin, I mean, as churches, we're always looking at the best, highest and best use and stewardship of our building. There's real-time stewardship, but there's also perceived stewardship, right? As far as the community and understanding
what we're presenting to.
There is a very real conversation to be had to make sure that we're not building and outpacing a community, because the last thing any of us want at churches is for the community to look in and say, look at that brand new building. Can you believe how much money they spent? Like, you really have to lean into the sensibilities of the community that you live in as well.
Yeah, that's good, I think. And adding to that a little bit too, is that we've seen a lot of times creating a reuse of the existing building, a remodel of the existing building. A lot of times there's some really strong character that you've developed at that specific church, that specific building. So, you know, like Austin mentioned, maybe there's a steeple or something, or maybe there's a specific feature that it has some history within the church. And so being able to kind of integrate that in a new way, in a reuse way, you know, creating some more contemporary feel to that space. Maybe it's as simple as just repainting the building does quite a bit of change to the entirety of the space when we think about some of those things. And so reusing that in a effective new way can be really impactful. The other thing too, we've done specifically with some of these, and I don't have any plans today to show them, but we've done a lot of churches where we've actually taken a traditional sanctuary that's kind of long and linear and actually just flipped it on its side 90 degrees, where you start thinking about, hey, now the auditorium is sideways. We've got a much closer from the stage to the back row, a lot closer. It becomes a much more intimate space. And there's a lot of churches that can do that pretty quickly with minimal remodel focus. And so creating a different feel to that space, sometimes it's a different entry because we're able to create a gathering area that's a little bit larger. Some of those kind of things as well start to kind of jump out as we begin to design these spaces in that way. I will say, you know, some of the negatives to this is that, you know, it's harder for professionals even to estimate costs when it comes to remodels. There are a lot of times where you start digging into a wall and you realize that, oh, that is a bearing wall, it turns out, or oh, there is something in that wall that we've got to move that we didn't know. You know, when you've got layer upon layer of remodels, sometimes you pull those layers back and you start to realize things that were there 2 remodels ago that maybe were forgotten, and now you've got to figure some of those things out. The other thing too is that, and this happens, you know, a lot of times, obviously in our personal lives as well, is that one fix leads to another, right? You start opening and saying, we're just going to replace the carpet. And then you go, well, while we're here, we might as well paint the wall. And well, the lights are up there, they should be changed too. And so some of these things can lead to another. Again, some of those things can kind of snowball when it comes to that. And that's why costs just a lot of times are kind of hard to estimate when it comes to understanding some of those things as we go through this. Ideally, towards the end, we start to get a feel for some of these things in a little bit deeper way, but still in the end, some of those things can be, it's hard to understand that. You kind of know what you're going into when you're building a new building, but some of these remodels can be a little bit trickier sometimes when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
That
and
can be
then
a problem too with older buildings, especially if you've got an older one and you're remodeling it and suddenly you find like the wiring isn't up to code. Well, now you have a much bigger problem because electricity, anything involving that is always expensive. So I'm sure you run into that a lot too. You can only estimate so much.
Sure, exactly. That's correct. Yep.
And then we've got accessibility issues too. You know, a lot of old churches weren't thinking about allowing everybody equally into the building as far as ramps and lifts and things like that and onto the stage. You know, like for instance, a ramp, for every inch you go up, you have to have a foot of run. And so if you have a 2-foot tall stage, you got to have a 24-foot long ramp. That's about 3.5 feet wide in order to get folks on the stage. And so some of these things can become pretty tricky in a remodel, and it'll take a lot more than you think to accommodate accessibility and other things, that you may not have expected.
Yeah, a couple of just kind of quick projects that I think illustrate some of the benefits that you can have for a remodel process. The first one, really, what we did, this was a recent project we did up in the upper Northwest, so that gives kind of a credence to some of the beams and stuff that you're thinking about. But they had a building with a long linear site, an existing auditorium space. It was actually, this is kind of a repurpose, but they've lived in this building as a church, and now they're thinking about an existing space or a new space that swings out the back, adds parking and things. They're really trying to maximize their site. But what they've done in the remodel context is really begin to say, hey, our kids' space as we grow is just bursting at the seams. We have no space. So they've turned their existing building really into what will now be a kids wing, a kids zone. Again, kind of creating that gathering space within, coming into that space, and then creating a larger auditorium as a part of this, offices and everything, but then turning and remodeling some space. There's some different walls that we've had to remove and push different things to create the hallway that's needed. The wider hallway, like we talked about earlier, was available even in this space. And so creating that kind of an area with that, I think, is what kind of brings some benefit to this.
Yeah, and Dave, while you're on that plan, it looks like you kind of accommodated some new security features too, probably that weren't there already as far as the kids.
Yeah,
space.
for sure. Yep, no doubt.
That's one of the really critical things when we're doing a remodel. Is 50 years ago they weren't thinking about security the way that we have to now, and so some of these kids areas, like anybody can be walking up and down the hallways, and there's pinch points and all these different sorts of things, and so we need to recognize that and plan for that. This project was a little bit more traditional looking building in Indiana, and they wanted to keep that look. The community liked it and the church liked it, and so we designed a new worship facility. Dave, if you want to go to the next plan there. We took the old worship center that's at the center there in the tan color. That was the old sanctuary. We turned that into the third place, or the hub, and so we still have that hub concept, or that spoken wheel kind of concept like we talked about for new buildings, but we were able to do that on a remodel in addition here in order to get those same kind of concepts. Security, secure wing for the kids off to the left there, that open area at the center, access to the offices. So when you're in that middle space, you can still see everything, get around. It's very open and very welcoming. And they were able to stay in their community, which is really important to them.
Yeah, and then kind of the last one I had is, one of the things that really odd things that you can do a lot of times as you think about reorganizing space, sometimes you don't realize how much space you have. And so in this case, this church actually had been developing some buildings over the life of its church on this location. They started with an auditorium and some different spaces on the left side here. They've added a kids wing. They added another gathering space, and they added some more classrooms. So they've got a couple of different classroom buildings. And as a part of this process, our goal was really to begin to consolidate things. What we do understand is that we don't do church the same way that we did 50 years ago. And in this case, the church has kind of been building through, and each time kind of saying, well, we can't reuse this space, so let's build a new this. We can't build a new this, so let's build, let's do this over here, and kind of adding space. And so as a part of this process, what we actually did was consolidate and reimagine some of these spaces. So we created a new central kids space, which is really kind of in this area with some floor plans and stuff like that. And as a part of this, actually, they're now going to be working with some local agencies, some local groups, to start leasing out some of their space for office spaces. And they've actually already got a client that's going to come in and take over a floor of space, so they're able to create some supplemental income. And I think that's one of the things that we're keen on. Matt, I think that's something that especially you're focused on, is ways that we can really, as a church, begin to use our space 7 days a week.
Yeah, absolutely. We know as ministry leaders that facility is one of the biggest items in our budget. It's a big item when it comes to our staff, how we use a building well. And so really figuring out, man, how do we partner with community organizations? How do we partner with great things that are already going on in our community? Or maybe how do we meet a need? So one of the things we're dealing with across the United States is there's a lot of communities that are childcare deserts. As more moms and dads are having to go back to work, what if we, as the church, said we're not just opening on Sunday, but we're opening our facility to really meet the needs that you have. And so these are all ways that when you take a fresh perspective and start to ask what if, when you proverbially put your ear to the railroad track of your community and start to hear the needs, hear what's coming down the line, it gives you a great opportunity to begin to see your building as a ministry center, not just a Sunday church building.
Yeah, that's good. So as we think about then kind of maybe the last topic here, the last point, which is basically repurposing. Again, it's just a matter of kind of thinking about what spaces you have available to you, right? And so we've talked about maybe it's a new building, maybe it's remodeling your existing space. The third one is what spaces are around you. And chances are there may be one that's around you that's pretty close to move-in ready. And so at the top of the list, obviously the easiest is maybe there's another church building, right? It's already there, it's in place. Maybe it fits your community perfectly. And so that's kind of the first thing. And the benefits to a lot of these things is that a lot of the utilities, a lot of the parking spaces, a lot of the spaces that you're going to need to use are already built in. Everything's already set up and potentially with minimal updates. This gets to the point when I say minimal updates of even to the point of a lot of times we struggle as an architecture firm getting through permitting in an accurate time. And so a church has to go in and get a conditional use permit, and they have to do these different pieces and then get a permit on top of that. And so there's a time frame involved depending on the municipality that you're working with that can really slow down this process as you go through the different approvals that are required to kind of be within that space. And so a lot of times that's kind of one of the main pieces that we think about is, are there existing buildings that already have those CUPs in place? Are there existing buildings that have things in place already that we can just kind of jump in and do minimal remodels from that perspective? And again, here again, the cost of the building many times will be that existing building will be in line with probably the amount of work that you've got to do to finish that off.
Hey, Austin, what would you say are some resources that BGW offers that can help churches in looking at existing buildings in their community? And we talked about site selection for raw land. What about when it comes to an existing building? What are some of the things that you look for in a building to say, hey, this could be a great potential for a church community?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things, Matt. First of all is the infrastructure. So we got to know, is the building big enough? Obviously, is the property big enough? But also every building is designed with a different occupancy classification. I don't mean to get too technical here, but for example, an office building, there's going to be a different parking requirement than for an assembly building like a church or a school or a daycare, different things like that. And so sometimes there may be an existing parking lot, there's existing infrastructure, but it's way off. Like you got 20% of the parking you need. So there's still going to be a lot of site work. Other times it lines up better. But then things like restrooms too, if it's an office building or something like that and the occupancy is a lot lower, then all of a sudden you take that out, put it in a sanctuary. We need to redo some of the infrastructure for sewers and water supply and that sort of thing, because we're going to have a lot more people in the building at one time. And so I think about those overall pictures. Like I said, is it big enough? Can you accommodate enough people on site with added parking, utility connections? But then also, if it's designed for a different use, it was designed for a different use. Like a grocery store, you probably don't notice it, but they've got columns maybe every 20 feet. They're just kind of hidden in the aisles, but that doesn't work for a church if you need a 80 or 100-foot span without columns. And so you can run into some big issues if you're kind of changing the use of that, because it was designed for a specific use, typically not for an assembly building. And you'll see a little bit more of that when we start going through some of these examples of just the extents you have to go to in order to repurpose a building that wasn't designed to hold 500 or 1,000 people all at once.
Yeah, let's hit a couple of these actually, because the key that I wanted to make with a lot of these slides specifically that we've got of different buildings we've done is just that there's a wide range of opportunities for buildings. There's different things within each one that create different issues that we've seen over the past few years. But generally, there's no specific building type that we say you have to do this one. Like Austin mentioned, we do have some office building opportunities. We did one recently, and one really cool thing about this, a lot of times they're 2 stories, they're low ceilings, obviously pretty low floor to floor, so it can be a little tricky at first when they get it. This church in California bought this office building, and you can see on the next slide here that they did have a low ceiling to begin with as they built into this. But on the benefit, the flip side, on the right side here, a lot of their offices, they just turned into classrooms, whether taking a wall down and creating one classroom, but space is available and perfect for that type of thing. And then as they grew, they actually ended up building a full auditorium that added on to that. They had the space, the potential to kind of do those kind of things. And so the office building concept is a great concept to start with, especially if you're a smaller church that can afford to go within that kind of low ceiling range in a 2-story concept like that. So this is one part where I did want to kind of bring on a little bit of expertise. Matt, you have done some significant work at this is your church right here, the Genesis Project in Ogden.
Yeah, so we're the Genesis Project is a 15-year-old church. And so when we started looking at our first permanent home, we were very budget conscious and just saying we need to spend as little amount of money as possible for a church that had grown considerable in size. So we needed a lot of square footage, a lot of space, in the tightest confines of budget that we could. And so what we found was an old building that needed a lot of work. It needed a lot of TLC, which meant we were able to get into that building economically well and really begin to just develop it as we moved into it. So really what Austin was speaking to, this building gave us an opportunity to kind of grow as we went, to take on phases of projects that we could afford as budget allowed, but really give us a lot of space that we never could have afforded from the onset in a brand new building. So really rehabbing an old building that was blighted and kind of a problem building in our community really reflected the mission and vision of our church to take old things and make them new, but also gave us a very economical way to grow into a larger space that, again, we just couldn't have afforded any other way.
Yeah, that's good. Another option that we've looked at recently, and we've done several of these actually, this is a bowling alley that we converted into a church. One of the interesting things about this that you don't normally notice within a bowling alleys actually have multiple floor levels. So not only are they a lot of times a little bit lower ceiling, but because of how the bowling lanes send the balls, return and everything, they actually pour the concrete floor on one, and then they step down about a foot or two to where the lanes are, and then they fill that in with the bowling alleys. And so a lot of times you go into these bowling alleys and they're pretty flat. They look, hey, this is great. We've got a great concept here. But then when they take the bowling lanes out, when they take all the equipment out, you end up with about 1.5 to 2 feet of difference in that floor that you've got to make up. And so it's kind of an interesting concept. The benefit to that is that a lot of times if you can make that work, you can actually gain a couple more feet in height of your ceiling in that area, which normally ends up being your auditorium space. The negative is that you've got to figure out how to navigate, like Austin mentioned earlier, that ramp length that you've got to get, 2 foot of ramp down. And so kind of an interesting thing here that we've realized as we get into that most of these have a simple issue like that. The benefit to this on the other side is that a lot of your front of house things, your cafe, your restrooms, all those kind of things are at the front, which is where you want them. And that's not the case so much in a lot of other spaces, in some of these other spaces like that.
Yeah, like this one, for example, is a Lowe's. And if you've been to these big stores, the restroom's almost always all the way to the back. And that doesn't exactly work for a church if you have to go all the way to the back, around the back of the sanctuary or what have you. But this project and the next one we had to raise the roof of the building in certain areas. And you might not think it going into a Lowe's. You think, oh, it's like a really high ceiling, you know, in there, but it wasn't high enough in order to get the auditorium to work. As you see the stadium seating at the back, in order to get the sound and the lighting right, we just had to push the ceiling up. And so we kind of removed the center of the building and pushed it all up. And so that comes at a cost. And that's something you really need to be thinking about is, you know, some of these things that seem simple, it can cost you quite a lot in the long run. So this next project, Grace Fellowship in Ohio, this was an old banquet hall and restaurant. You can see these images at the top, the lobby area, that's how the whole building was, you know, it was maybe 12 or 13 feet floor to ceiling. This is about a 600 seat auditorium, and it just did not work. But they were constrained in such a way, they were getting kicked out of their old building, and there was not a lot of property in this area. They had very few options. They landed on this building, and we essentially built a new building in the center of the old building in order to get that amazing ceiling height in there, in order for all the technology, acoustics, and all that to work within that space.
Another one we've done, actually a couple of these, is actually a lumber yard. That unique characteristics for this specific one is they had a lot of outbuildings. Here again, they were able to begin to utilize some of these and slowly finish out some of these spaces in order to rent them and lease them for community functions. They had a couple of different entrepreneurial businesses going into some of these spaces. The other trick to lumber yards, which is really unique to it, is that, like Austin mentioned earlier, there's a lot of times some different uses or different occupancy ratings. And within that, there actually is a requirement for there to be a big firewall in the middle between kind of where the lumber actually is and where the front of the building is. And so there's some navigating of some of those columns and things like that as you go through the space in there.
Yeah, this discovery in Pennsylvania, this was an old family fun center. If you find one of these, you're in luck because if they have a mini golf, like what kind of church wouldn't want a mini golf in the backyard? And so we took the family fun center, we, you know, took out some interior walls and moved things around. But this was awesome because they already had a large bank restrooms in an area we could use. They already have an amazing kitchen. They use that on Sundays. They serve pizza and nachos, and the kids play on the mini golf outside. So this project was still expensive for a couple other reasons, but at the same time, there's a lot of that infrastructure in place that you can use, and there's opportunities like having an amazing mini golf in your backyard for the kids to play on while the parents, you know, watch the football games after church. And so, like Matt said earlier, like asking the question, what if, you know, and for them, they saw this building was available, and it led to some opportunities that they might not have thought about had it not been for the building and the way it existed already before they got into it.
Yeah. Another one of these that we've seen is just the repurpose of a grocery store. Grocery stores, again, just like Austin mentioned with retail, we've done a couple of these, but a lot of times they have kind of some weird different things to that. One of those things a lot of times is, and some of the newer ones, you might see the restrooms at the front, but a lot of these older ones that we've repurposed have the restrooms at the back. All the plumbing's in the back where the kitchen and the deli is. And so trying to make sure you reorient some of these things. There's also issues a lot of times, again, with a different occupancy rate, you've got to upgrade some of your mechanical units potentially, or your roof type things, or you've got some column issues that you're going through. This is one, again, of a repurposed strip center. This is a church down in Arizona. And the benefit to them, again, here is they've actually bought the entire strip. And so now they've got 2 or 3 different restaurants in the rest of the strip center mall. And they're able to kind of lease those out and pull money back from that, in addition to the use of the church during the day. In this case, their ceiling was tall enough for what they needed. They didn't have to have any issues with that.
By and large, as you both look at these projects, could you speak to the potential for a church to save money going into an existing building like this? Do you see that these tend to be more expensive, less expensive, or maybe on par with new construction? I know that's a loaded question, but
Yeah, I'll start with that, David. I think it's typically a little bit less than building new completely, because you do have some parking infrastructure, you do have the overall structure of the building. You're getting around some of that permitting costs and impact fees and some of those sorts of things. The site is already designed for retention and things like that. So it's probably a little bit less typically than a totally new building, but it kind of depends on how much you need to change and what type of facility you find.
Yeah, and again, I think the benefit to it is that you're trying to find a space that you can utilize and grow into, maybe too, and that you don't have to build everything at once, right? We can go in there. In some cases, we've had churches that have said, that's great, we're going to use the kids' future auditorium as our auditorium to start, and our main auditorium is over here on the other side, and we're not going to finish half of this building. The first half is built, the other half isn't. Or, you know, just seeing what you can come up with. And again, every one of these projects that we showed started with an idea of just what if, what are our options when we look at some of these different spaces, what's in our community in an area. And I think the thing I would start with specifically, and if you're thinking that repurpose route, is to begin to look at what part of the community do I want to be in? What part of the community are we really trying to minister to as a church? And begin to look in that area. And a lot of times pretty quickly, these buildings come and go quickly. So again, having a real estate agent being ready to go, having someone on your side that's digging into these, especially commercial deals, a lot of these happen pretty quickly, and they kind of happen a lot of times before they may even hit the market sometimes with some of these things. And so you're going to see that as you jump into this, hey, we've got to have somebody on our side. Again, that kind of, hey, let's get a real estate agent that can help us, that understands this market and knows where to go with these things.
I think the big idea, guys, as we wrap up our time here today, is that the value of bringing professionals in early on as possible, that can help you explore all of these ideas. I know that can look and really help you compare and contrast all of the strengths and all of the weaknesses of each opportunity you have as a church, is in the end going to leave you with the best product possible for you and for your community. And so on behalf of all of us here and all of BGW, we would just love to give you an open invitation to engage us. There's so much that we can do with technology and Google Earth and helping you with site selection and helping you with a fresh set of eyes on your existing building that you're in. And our heart is to be a partner with your ministry as you move forward, and hopefully to be a tool in your tool belt that maybe you don't have, but you don't need to have, because there are guys out there like Building God's Way who have a passion to see the kingdom of God grow and have a passion to help serve your church. So, man, coming out of this, we would love to connect with you. We would love to talk with you about the various projects that we do around the country and even in your own area, and begin to discern and decide together how we could play a vital part of your team and help give you some professional advice. So on behalf of all of Building God's Way, Dave and Austin, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. And please reach out. You can find us at bgwservices.com. Reach out to any of us there, and we would love to begin a conversation with you as you grow forward in the ministry that God's called you to. Thank you.
All right, I think that was some great information. Thanks to all of you who have attended, and thanks for you at BGW Building God's Way.